One wrong translation can erase $100 million in a single sentence. The words echoed inside the glass-walled negotiation room long before anyone realized how true they were. Ethan Caldwell, a billionaire CEO known across the United States for closing deals that reshaped entire industries, sat at the head of a polished conference table overlooking downtown Chicago. In front of him lay a contract worth over $150 million, a European expansion agreement that required absolute precision in every clause. Across from him, the German delegation waited with calm discipline, their expressions controlled, their expectations clear. Between them stood Michael Reeves, the corporate translator hired to bridge every linguistic gap in the room. Behind the formal structure of the meeting, Sophie Grant moved quietly as part of the service staff, carrying a tray of water glasses with the kind of practiced invisibility that allowed her to observe without interruption. She had worked in environments like this long enough to understand that the most important conversations were not always the ones spoken loudly, but the ones hidden inside small inconsistencies. Ethan reviewed the contract again, his eyes scanning numbers, percentages, and legal phrasing that determined risk distribution between continents. He trusted his team, he trusted the translator, and above all, he trusted the structure that had always protected his decisions. But something subtle broke that rhythm. A single sentence translated from German into English felt unusually softened, almost too convenient, as if responsibility had been quietly shifted without permission. He paused, his pen hovering above the page. The German lead executive spoke again, and Michael Reeves translated quickly, confidently, but Sophie's attention sharpened immediately. The phrasing she heard did not match the tone of the original sentence she had caught earlier. It was not a dramatic error. It was something more dangerous, a slight adjustment that could change liability exposure by millions. Sophie stopped moving for a fraction of a second, then stepped closer without drawing attention. Her voice, when it came, was calm and controlled as she addressed the translation directly, repeating the original German phrasing with perfect accuracy that surprised even the delegation. The room shifted instantly. Ethan looked up from the contract, his attention locking onto her for the first time. Michael Reeves frowned and insisted she was mistaken, but Sophie did not argue. Instead, she translated the sentence again, this time explaining the legal nuance that had been removed, a nuance that completely altered the financial responsibility in the agreement. The German executives immediately reacted, confirming her interpretation without hesitation. Ethan's expression tightened as he realized the implications. He raised one hand, signaling a pause in the meeting. No one spoke. The air in the room became heavier, not with conflict, but with realization. Sophie stood still, neither defensive nor emotional, simply precise. Ethan studied her carefully, the confidence of a man who had built empires now interrupted by the quiet certainty of someone he had never considered relevant to the outcome of his world. For the first time in years, he was not leading the conversation. He was questioning it. The negotiation room remained suspended in a controlled silence after the pause, as if the entire building itself was waiting for the next interpretation to determine what reality would become. Ethan Caldwell kept his gaze forward, but his attention was no longer anchored in confidence. It was now divided between the contract in front of him and the quiet disruption that had just entered the structure of his thinking. Across the table, the German delegation waited patiently, their expressions unreadable, disciplined, and unchanged. Michael Reeves adjusted his posture slightly, attempting to regain composure, but the earlier interruption had already introduced uncertainty into his role. Sophie Grant returned to her position near the service station, her movement smooth and unremarkable, yet the atmosphere around her had subtly shifted. She was no longer just background presence. Ethan noticed that without consciously deciding to. He had spent years evaluating people based on titles, credentials, and institutional validation, yet none of those categories seemed to explain what had just occurred. The contract still lay open, but the meaning of its clauses now felt less stable, as if language itself had become something that could be shaped incorrectly without immediate detection. One of the German executives leaned slightly forward and spoke again in a measured tone. Michael translated quickly, but this time Ethan did not immediately accept the interpretation. He watched Sophie instead. She was not reacting emotionally, nor seeking attention, but her focus had narrowed subtly, as if she was listening to something beneath the surface of the conversation. When another clause was translated, Sophie paused briefly, her eyes moving across the document as though mapping internal consistency rather than simply hearing words. Ethan noticed it. A pattern was forming, though he could not yet define it. Sophie stepped forward again, not interrupting the meeting but aligning herself within it, and clarified a phrase in English that contradicted the softened interpretation delivered moments earlier. Her correction was precise, measured, and linguistically exact, leaving no room for ambiguity. Michael immediately objected, insisting that his translation reflected the intended meaning of the original statement, but Sophie calmly repeated the German phrasing, this time adding contextual structure that revealed the legal consequence of the wording. The German delegation responded almost instantly, confirming her version without hesitation. Ethan felt a shift in his decision-making process that he could not ignore. He had built his reputation on identifying risk before it materialized, and what he was witnessing now was not an argument. It was misalignment between language and intent at a structural level. He raised his hand again, this time slower, more deliberate, signaling a second pause in the meeting. The room complied immediately. No one spoke. Sophie remained still, her posture unchanged, as if this level of attention was something she had anticipated long before anyone else. Ethan studied her in silence. The environment around him, once predictable and controlled, now felt slightly unfamiliar, not because it had changed but because his perception of it had been corrected. For the first time in years, he was no longer fully certain that the system he trusted to interpret truth was functioning correctly. The pause in the negotiation did not dissolve the tension. It deepened it, settling over the conference table like a weight that no one could comfortably ignore. Ethan Caldwell remained seated, his hands now resting still on either side of the contract as if physical control could restore conceptual certainty. The German delegation exchanged brief, restrained glances, waiting for the structure of the meeting to stabilize again. But the real instability was no longer in the document. It was in interpretation. Michael Reeves cleared his throat softly and attempted to resume his role, repeating the next section of the agreement in English with deliberate confidence, but the tone carried a subtle strain that had not been there before. Sophie Grant observed without interrupting, her focus moving between the German speaker's facial expression and the written contract terms in front of Ethan. She was not reacting to volume or emphasis. She was tracking consistency. When Michael translated a clause regarding financial liability distribution between parties, Sophie's attention sharpened slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if a familiar pattern had repeated one time too many. Ethan noticed her stillness again. It was not passive silence. It was analytical restraint. The German lead spoke again, this time with a slight adjustment in phrasing, and Michael delivered the interpretation quickly, smoothing the sentence into something more neutral. But Sophie stepped forward at that exact moment, not abruptly, but with calm timing that suggested certainty rather than reaction. She pointed to the clause in the printed contract and spoke clearly, correcting a single phrase that altered the direction of responsibility from shared obligation to unilateral coverage. The change was small in structure but significant in consequence. Michael immediately responded, insisting that the nuance she referenced was not relevant to the legal interpretation, but Sophie calmly repeated the original German phrasing again, slower this time, allowing the exact structure of the sentence to stand on its own. The German delegation responded without delay, confirming her interpretation with firm agreement. A brief silence followed, heavier than before. Ethan slowly leaned forward, his attention fully locked on Sophie now. He was no longer observing a background presence. He was evaluating a disruption in a system he had trusted without question. He asked Michael to step back from the translation for a moment, his voice controlled but no longer fully neutral. The request alone shifted authority in the room. Michael hesitated, visibly unsettled, but complied. Sophie remained where she stood, neither advancing nor retreating, her expression unchanged. Ethan reviewed the clause again, reading it himself now, comparing it mentally against what had been spoken minutes earlier. The discrepancy was no longer theoretical. It was visible. The realization did not arrive as emotion. It arrived as correction. He looked back at Sophie and asked her how she was able to catch something that his own legal and linguistic team had missed. Sophie responded simply that she was listening for intent rather than surface translation, and that subtle shifts in structure often reveal more than direct vocabulary. The explanation was calm, almost understated, but it reframed the entire room. Ethan did not speak immediately. For the first time since the meeting began, he was no longer certain that control belonged to the people seated at the head of the table. It had quietly shifted to the person who had not been invited to speak at all. The atmosphere inside the glass-walled boardroom tightened further as the realization settled across the table, like an invisible pressure that no contract could regulate. Ethan Caldwell remained standing now, no longer seated at the head of the table, as if instinctively adjusting his position in response to a shift he could not fully control. The German delegation waited with disciplined patience, but their earlier confidence had changed into careful attention, now aware that every translated sentence carried consequences beyond formality. Michael Reeves attempted to re-establish authority in the flow of communication, but his voice no longer carried the same certainty. Each translation now felt exposed to scrutiny that had not existed minutes earlier. Sophie Grant stood quietly at the edge of the discussion space, her posture unchanged, her presence still understated, yet impossible to ignore. Ethan observed her more directly now, not as a background staff member, but as a variable he had not accounted for in the structure of this negotiation. Another clause was presented in German, and Michael translated it into English with technical fluency, but Sophie's attention sharpened again almost instantly. She stepped forward only when the sentence concluded, not interrupting, but positioning her correction precisely after completion. She pointed to a specific line in the contract and clarified that the translation had softened a conditional obligation into a guaranteed assumption, fundamentally altering financial responsibility across both parties. The German lead immediately confirmed her correction without hesitation, reinforcing the accuracy of her interpretation. A subtle shift passed through the room. Ethan raised his hand slightly, signaling another pause, but this time the gesture felt different. It was no longer procedural control. It was acknowledgement of uncertainty. Michael attempted to defend his interpretation, explaining his linguistic reasoning, but Sophie responded calmly by breaking down the grammatical structure of the original German phrasing, highlighting how modal verbs changed legal obligation rather than intent. Her explanation was not emotional or confrontational. It was precise, structured, and impossible to dismiss without direct contradiction from the source language. Ethan listened without interruption. For the first time, he was not evaluating outcome. He was evaluating reliability. He turned slowly toward Michael and asked a simple question about whether the original clause had been verified directly against the written German version before translation. The silence that followed was immediate and telling. Michael hesitated before answering, and in that hesitation, Ethan understood more than any spoken confirmation could provide. Sophie did not speak further unless addressed, maintaining distance from authority while simultaneously redefining it through accuracy alone. Ethan looked back at the contract, then at the German delegation, then finally at Sophie. The structure of the meeting had not collapsed, but it had been fundamentally reoriented around a single realization that interpretation itself could not be assumed. And in that realization, control shifted in a way that no one at the table had formally agreed to, but everyone now quietly recognized. The evening light over Chicago had shifted into a colder shade of gold by the time the negotiation resumed, casting long reflections across the glass walls of the corporate boardroom, as if the entire space were suspended between certainty and collapse. Ethan Caldwell remained standing near the center of the table now, no longer in a fixed position of authority, but in a more cautious stance that reflected the recalibration happening inside his mind. The German delegation had adjusted their posture as well, no longer passive recipients of interpretation, but active participants in verifying every sentence spoken. Sophie Grant stood slightly apart from the main cluster of decision-makers, her presence still understated, but now undeniably central to the flow of communication. Michael Reeves attempted to regain partial control of the translation process, but every word he delivered was now being mentally cross-checked by multiple parties in the room. Ethan watched Sophie carefully as another clause was introduced in German, this time related to escalation conditions in case of regulatory dispute. Michael translated it quickly into English, but before the sentence could fully settle, Sophie stepped forward with measured calm and pointed out a structural inconsistency between the spoken phrasing and the written legal document. She did not interrupt the meeting abruptly. Instead, she allowed the sentence to finish, then identified the precise linguistic shift that had altered responsibility allocation from conditional shared risk to implied unilateral obligation. The German lead executive immediately responded, confirming that Sophie's interpretation aligned with their original intent, not the softened version presented in translation. A low murmur passed through the room as several participants began reviewing their printed copies more carefully. Ethan slowly moved closer to the table, his eyes scanning the clause himself now, reading it line by line as if verifying reality directly rather than through interpretation. The realization forming in his mind was not dramatic, but structural. The system he had trusted to convert language into agreement had introduced variability without visibility. Michael attempted to explain the discrepancy, but his explanation no longer carried authority. It sounded procedural rather than certain. Sophie remained composed, offering no emotional reaction, only clarification when requested. Ethan finally asked a direct question, not to the translator, but to Sophie, asking how many similar inconsistencies she had noticed since the beginning of the negotiation. Her response was calm and precise. She explained that once a pattern of translation distortion appears, it rarely exists as a single event, but often as a repeated structural behavior across multiple clauses. That statement changed the atmosphere in the room again, because it implied that what they had already agreed upon earlier might also require verification. The German delegation paused their discussion entirely, waiting for confirmation before proceeding further. Ethan raised his hand once more, not to control the room, but to halt it completely. The negotiation stopped. Silence returned, but it was no longer the same silence from earlier. It was investigative, uncertain, and filled with recalculation. Ethan looked at Sophie, no longer as an external observer of the system, but as someone now embedded inside its correction process. And in that moment, he understood that the outcome of this deal would no longer be determined by assumption, but by the accuracy of a single voice that had already proven it could see what others had missed. The final phase of the negotiation began not with confidence, but with verification, as every participant in the glass-walled boardroom now understood that nothing could proceed without first confirming the accuracy of what had already been spoken. Ethan Caldwell stood near the center of the table, no longer positioned as a commanding authority, but as a decision-maker forced into caution, his attention shifting constantly between the contract, the German delegation, and Sophie Grant. The atmosphere was no longer purely corporate. It had become investigative, as if the entire room had transformed into a system of truth validation, rather than agreement execution. Michael Reeves remained near the translation position, but his role had diminished into something reactive rather than directive. Sophie stood calmly near the edge of the discussion space, her presence steady, unchanging, and increasingly central to every pause in the conversation. Ethan requested that the previous 3 clauses be reread directly from the original German version, without interpretation. The German lead executive complied, speaking clearly and deliberately, while Michael translated cautiously, aware that each phrase would now be examined rather than accepted. As the translation unfolded, Sophie intervened only when necessary, correcting subtle shifts in meaning that altered legal obligation boundaries between parties. Each correction she made was supported immediately by confirmation from the German side, reinforcing that her interpretation aligned with the original intent, rather than the adjusted version presented earlier. Ethan listened without interruption, his focus intensifying as a pattern became undeniable. The discrepancies were not random. They followed a consistent structural bias that favored reduced liability on one side of the agreement. When the third correction was confirmed, Ethan finally raised his hand and halted the discussion entirely. The room stopped instantly. He looked at Michael for a long moment, then redirected his attention to Sophie. His voice was calm but no longer neutral. He asked her to walk him through the pattern she had identified. Sophie explained without hesitation that the inconsistencies were not isolated translation errors, but repeated structural adjustments occurring at key legal pressure points within the document. She described how conditional phrasing in German had been repeatedly converted into definitive statements in English, subtly altering responsibility without changing apparent meaning. As she spoke, Ethan turned back to the contract, scanning earlier sections with renewed scrutiny. What had once appeared precise now revealed subtle instability under cross-linguistic review. The German delegation confirmed again that their original intent had never matched the softened English interpretation in several sections. A quiet shift passed through the room as realization spread evenly across all participants. Ethan finally closed the contract folder and placed it flat on the table, not in rejection but in pause. He acknowledged that the negotiation could not continue until every translated clause was verified directly against source language structure. For the first time since the meeting began, control was no longer defined by authority or title, but by accuracy. And in that recalibrated space, Sophie Grant remained the only person whose interpretation had consistently aligned with both sides of the conversation, quietly reshaping the outcome of a deal that no longer belonged to assumption, but to verification. The boardroom remained still after the final verification request, as if every person inside had collectively agreed that no further progress could happen without absolute clarity, and that silence was now part of the decision-making process. Ethan Caldwell stood near the center of the glass table, no longer projecting authority, but absorbing responsibility for the first time in a way that felt unfamiliar even to him. The German delegation waited patiently, their posture unchanged, but their attention now fully aligned with the correction process rather than the negotiation itself. Michael Reeves remained quiet, no longer attempting to lead interpretation, his earlier confidence replaced by restraint. Sophie Grant stood at a slight distance from the main table, calm and steady, her presence no longer peripheral but structurally central to every remaining exchange. Ethan finally broke the silence by requesting that the final section of the contract be reviewed line by line directly from the original German text, without summary or adjustment. The German lead executive agreed immediately, and the room entered a slower, more deliberate phase of communication. Each sentence was now spoken carefully in German, translated cautiously into English, and silently evaluated before acceptance. As the final clauses were read, Sophie intervened only when necessary, correcting subtle phrasing differences that carried significant legal weight. Each correction was confirmed by the German delegation without hesitation, reinforcing a consistent pattern that had now become undeniable. Ethan followed the process closely, no longer relying on interpretation from any single source. Instead, he compared meaning across languages, speakers, and structure, slowly reconstructing the agreement from its original form, rather than its translated version. When the final clause was completed and verified, a long pause settled over the room. There was no celebration or confrontation, only recognition that what had once been a completed agreement had now transformed into a corrected version of itself. Ethan slowly closed the contract folder and placed it in the center of the table, signaling the end of negotiation under previous terms. He looked at the German delegation and confirmed that they were now aligned on the revised understanding. They responded with agreement. Then he turned toward Sophie. The room remained silent as his attention fully focused on her. He acknowledged that without her intervention, the agreement would have proceeded under incorrect interpretation, potentially resulting in significant structural imbalance between both parties. His voice was steady, but now carried a different tone, one shaped less by authority and more by recognition. He asked her how long she had been able to detect linguistic distortion at this level. Sophie replied calmly that it was not about detecting distortion, but about recognizing when language no longer matched intent. That distinction settled deeply in the room, because it reframed everything that had just occurred. Ethan nodded slowly, processing not only the outcome of the negotiation, but the implication of how easily it could have been controlled without detection. He made a final decision in that moment, not as a continuation of the deal, but as a structural change to how future negotiations would be conducted. He stated that Sophie Grant would be consulted for all future multilingual agreements involving Caldwell Global Industries, not as staff, but as independent linguistic authority. The German delegation acknowledged the decision with approval. Michael Reeves stepped back quietly, no longer part of the central process. Sophie did not react with surprise or satisfaction. She simply accepted the acknowledgement as a continuation of responsibility rather than elevation. As the meeting concluded and participants began to leave the room, Ethan remained for a moment longer, looking at the city through the glass wall. For the first time, he understood that control was not defined by who spoke the most, but by who ensured that what was spoken remained true. The meeting room on the upper floor of the Chicago Tower was nearly empty now, But the weight of what had just occurred still lingered in the still air like a decision that had not fully settled into reality. Ethan Caldwell remained by the glass wall, looking down at the city below, his reflection faintly layered over the skyline lights. The negotiation had officially concluded, but his mind continued replaying every translated clause, every correction, and every moment where certainty had quietly shifted into doubt before being restored again by precision. Sophie Grant stood a few steps behind him, not intruding on his space, but no longer positioned as an unnoticed presence. She was part of the structure that had just redefined how the agreement came into existence. Ethan finally turned slightly toward her, his expression no longer guarded, but measured with recognition that carried more weight than approval alone. He asked her directly why she never interfered in situations like this before, if she had the ability to identify such distortions in language all along. Sophie paused briefly before answering, explaining that intervention was never about capability, but about necessity, and that most systems correct themselves only when errors become unavoidable. Her voice remained calm, with no sense of self-importance, as if what had just occurred was simply a correction of alignment rather than an extraordinary event. Ethan listened carefully, absorbing not only her words but the perspective behind them. It was a way of thinking that did not rely on hierarchy, but on structure and accuracy. A few moments of silence followed, during which Ethan stepped away from the glass and returned to the table where the contract still lay open, now marked with revisions that had been confirmed by both sides. He reviewed the final pages again, not to verify decisions, but to understand the process that had prevented those decisions from being flawed. Sophie remained nearby, observing without pressure, her presence steady but unobtrusive. Ethan then made a quiet acknowledgement that the negotiation had succeeded not because of authority or negotiation skill, but because accuracy had been protected at the critical moment. He stated that future international agreements under his company would require independent linguistic verification, at the level Sophie had demonstrated. The statement was not ceremonial. It was structural. The German delegation, still present at the far end of the table, agreed with the adjustment, recognizing its necessity. Michael Reeves, now fully outside the center of the process, accepted the outcome without resistance, understanding that his role had been redefined by what had just occurred. As the participants began to leave the room one by one, Ethan remained for a final moment, looking at the contract and then at Sophie. There was no dramatic conclusion, no emotional resolution, only a quiet realization forming within him. The system he had built to ensure control had always depended on trust in translation, interpretation, and delegation. But what he had witnessed was something simpler and far more fundamental. Truth did not depend on position. It depended on precision. And for the first time in his career, Ethan understood that the most valuable person in the room had not been the one who spoke the most, but the one who ensured that every word meant exactly what it was supposed to mean. The final hour of the day in the Chicago skyscraper felt quieter than the hours before it, as if the building itself had exhaled after holding tension for too long. The negotiation room was now empty except for Ethan Caldwell and Sophie Grant, with the remaining documents neatly organized on the polished table that reflected the last traces of daylight. Ethan stood near the center of the space, no longer surrounded by delegates, translators, or legal advisors, only the echo of what had just been reconstructed through correction rather than assumption. Sophie remained a few steps away, maintaining the same calm presence she had held throughout the entire process, as if nothing about the outcome required celebration or emotional reaction. Ethan finally spoke, his voice lower now, stripped of the urgency that had defined earlier exchanges. He acknowledged that what had occurred was not simply a successful negotiation, but a structural correction of how information itself was trusted inside his organization. He stated that from this moment forward, no multilingual agreement would proceed without independent linguistic verification, at the level Sophie had demonstrated. The statement was simple, but its implications were significant, effectively placing accuracy as a requirement equal to authority. Sophie listened without interruption, then responded only that systems built on trust must always be prepared to be corrected. Otherwise they eventually fail under their own assumptions. There was no pride in her tone, only clarity, as if she was describing something inevitable rather than extraordinary. Ethan studied her for a moment longer, realizing that her role in the process had never been about intervention, but about restoring alignment between meaning and intent whenever they diverged. The German delegation had already left the building, and Michael Reeves had been reassigned quietly to secondary duties within the legal department, marking a clear shift in how responsibility was distributed following the outcome of the negotiation. Ethan walked slowly toward the glass wall, looking out over the city lights that stretched across Chicago, and for the first time, he did not see the skyline as a symbol of control, but as a system dependent on countless unseen corrections that made stability possible. He turned back toward Sophie and asked her what she intended to do now that her role in the negotiation had concluded. Sophie paused briefly before answering that she would continue working as she always had, remaining where she was needed until she was no longer needed. The simplicity of her answer carried more weight than any formal position or title. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding that some forms of expertise did not seek recognition, only accuracy. As Sophie prepared to leave the room, Ethan added one final statement, not as an instruction but as acknowledgement, that the system he had built would not have survived the day without her corrections. Sophie did not respond with affirmation or emotion. She simply accepted the statement as fact. The door closed quietly behind her as she exited, leaving Ethan alone in the glass room, surrounded by the quiet reflection of a city built on agreements, assumptions, and interpretations. And in that silence, he understood something that would remain with him far beyond this negotiation, that truth inside any system was never guaranteed by power, but only preserved by those willing to ensure it remained exact.